Hello everybody, my name is Daulton Nelson and today I'd like to give my thoughts on a game I just beat. That game being Resident Evil 3, the 2020 remake, for the PS4. Resident Evil 3 is an action Metroidvania developed and published by Capcom. If we look at my favorite games I played last year, then we'll see that I placed the 2019 remake of Resident Evil 2 high on my list. And that was for good reason. Resident Evil 2 is a masterclass in horror-themed explorative gameplay. It brought in influences from Metroidvania games to deliver an experience just begging to be replayed, and iterated upon by the player until they became masters of the campaign. And it seemed to me that as the year went on, more and more people realized just how brilliant that remake really was. So when another Resident Evil remake was announced by Capcom, it quickly became one of the most anticipated releases of 2020. I was included in that. I had very high hopes for this game, very high expectations, especially since not only had Capcom proven themselves with the remake of Resident Evil 2, but had also had another great showing prior to that with the equally brilliant Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So, after all of this hype, with the Resident Evil 3 remake out for a couple weeks at this point, and having played through the game twice, I think this follow-up is kind of disappointing. Put it this way, if Resident Evil 2 Remake was a tight, focused horror experience, then Resident Evil 3 Remake is its messy, confused little sister. Where Resident Evil 2 was more sprawling and allowed for player exploration, Resident Evil 3 is definitely going in a different direction, with a more linear slant to its progression, and an experience that feels less dense. That isn't to say the Metroidvania influences aren't here anymore, they definitely still are. But instead of the whole game being an interconnected jungle gym that players can snake through, instead, the explorative moments are more condensed, scaled down even. It acts a little more like you're on a linear quest, but see a break-off point and decide to explore it to see if it hides any goodies. Of course, the game is more open than that specific example, but these excursions don't carry the same rewarding weight like they did in the game's predecessor. And part of that is due to Resident Evil 3 taking a more action-oriented emphasis to its gameplay. You get plenty of ammo just picking things up off the ground as you move forward, as the game supplies better weaponry much earlier this time around. I don't think this kind of direction is bad outright. After all, Capcom would continue with this direction to some success back in the day with Resident Evil 4. But I can't help but feel like Resident Evil 3 is more transitional in this regard when it comes to its core structure and the tools it inherits from its predecessor. Case in point, there is a lot of mechanics that carry on from Resident Evil 2 into Resident Evil 3, which I think is good overall, except for the camera, movement system, and shooting system. These mechanics in Resident Evil 3 still feel like they're geared more towards the survival horror experience, which doesn't work well when the pace of the game picks up. The close camera obscures the enemy positions, the sluggish movement inhibits player attempts to escape attacks or gain distance, and things like the accuracy and reload times are designed specifically for enemies that are slow. As mentioned prior, the developers do try to alleviate this by giving the player stronger weapons earlier, as well as giving the player a neat dodge move that, when executed correctly, will let the player roll to safety. Sometimes you'll even enter bullet time, allowing you to hit vital points easier. And despite my dismay at the contrasting mix of mechanics, Resident Evil 3 does have its very effective moments, where it gets across what it's going for. I'm thinking of moments like the very unnerving and tension-filled hospital crawl, or the action-packed final leg of the game. Still, these sections are disconnected. There are never moments where the new action direction and the old horror direction mix well together. The most explicit of which, and a good example of how mixing the two styles of play doesn't work, would be the bug maze section. This section features a gross-looking environment with exclusive enemy types that will inject parasites into one of the protagonists of the game, Jill Valentine. These parasites will degrade the player's health until they die. The only way to get rid of them is to consume a green herb. Furthermore, there is this constantly ascending score that plays through the scene, which gives off a good sense of tension. However, the scene's intended effect wears off quickly, as just before the player enters the maze, they're given a letter telling them about the herb remedy, as well as 2 green herbs right next to that. When the player enters the maze, they're automatically injected with parasites. Of course, given that they were just handed 2 herbs, the player can heal right away, so that problem's solved. And then, to make things easier, all the bugs in this maze can easily be dispensed with a shotgun blast, which you will most likely have at this time. Thus, the whole scene falls apart. And then, of course, this mechanic never shows up again in the game. I really wonder why Capcom thought its inclusion was necessary if they were just going to undermine the whole thing and never use it again. Aside from the conflicting elements of action and survival horror, there are also other elements in Resident Evil 3 that I think bring it down. Like, your health not showing up whenever you take damage anymore. Why this feature was taken out, I have no clue. There are also these bulky blue hunter enemy types you find in sewers who look ridiculous and out of place. They're also the only enemy type in the game that reveal a big video game weak spot, which is silly given the otherwise natural weak spots of the zombies, or the other enemy hunter type later on in the game. Mr. X from the previous game took a huge downgrade, as now he is in the form of Nemesis. The namesake of the original game, I thought Nemesis would play a larger role in the gameplay than he actually does. Most of the time he's relegated to a boss fight, or a chasing section where all you have to do is move forward to clear it. When he actually is thrown into the core gameplay, Nemesis gets in the way constantly. Unlike Mr. X, who snaked through the hallways as you hid from him, delivering some bone-chilling footsteps reminding you of his presence, Nemesis, on the other hand, just follows you constantly. Even if you try to hide, he just stands outside the door. The only options you are given are to run from him or damage him enough to subdue him temporarily. It completely gets rid of any tension the player might feel from him as soon as you find out he can just cartoonishly drop from the sky from seemingly anywhere. Speaking of a lack of tension, the story of this game? Super predictable. Every time something would happen in the story, you could just call what would happen next from a mile away. Like, a constant gag the narrative pulls is the supposed death of Nemesis in cutscenes. Whenever Jill would report his death out loud, my eyes would roll in the back of my head, and I'd let out an audible sigh. And sure enough, not even 2 minutes later he would return. What a surprise. There are also characters that are introduced whose arc is visible from a mile away. It doesn't help that the structure of the story is largely the same from previous Resident Evil entries. Start in location, but end up in a secret lab. Speaking of bringing things back, locations and characters from Resident Evil 2 Remake show up in 3 for no reason. It's just like suddenly while in the middle of the story, you're at Kendo's gun shop, or the Raccoon City Police Department, but they serve no purpose. You could substitute Kendo's gun shop for Sally's shoe store, and you'd get the same results. Plus, do we really need the origin story of that cop's stomach bite from 2? Do we really need to follow up on Kendo? It feels like these moments are here to try to invoke some sort of nostalgia, but not only was all of this stuff just introduced last year, but Capcom doesn't do anything to tie it in with Jill's or Carlos's, the other protagonist's, story. It just feels like pandering and comes off as offensive. All that being said, the story and the world of the game isn't all bad. I really like the dialogue the characters use. It feels like it's coming out of a cheesy action movie. It's pretty fun to listen to. It was even giving off some Half-Life vibes. I also love how this game looks. The environments are well built, very well laid out. There seems to be a lot of detailed, intentional clutter that makes Raccoon City that much more believable. One of my favorite moments of world building in the game is actually in its beginning scene, where you start off in the first-person mode as Jill. You get to see her room, and by proxy her personality, firsthand. Capcom packs a ton of detail here, really showing off their technical prowess. I was even impressed by some fluttering papers stuck to a wall that were reacting to the wind of a fan. It's a small detail that speaks a lot to Capcom's environmental planning. I'm also a big fan of the different styles of play that came with playing as the 2 different protagonists. Jill's gameplay slanted more towards classic Resident Evil, while Carlos seemed to be more action-focused. I felt that switching between the 2 as the story went along created a neat flow to the game overall. And, of course, What is a Resident Evil game without replayability? And 3 delivers. The optimization you get from each playthrough is still here. Also, instead of the achievement-based unlockables you would see in Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake now uses a point system for unlocking new items. You get these points by completing achievements, but what you unlock is completely up to you. I like this approach. Players can tailor their subsequent playthroughs how they wish. That's a neat freedom to have. And I do want to leave Resident Evil 3 Remake off on a positive note. I still enjoyed my time overall, but I do feel like this is a massive downgrade from what we got of Resident Evil last year. So I'm going to give Resident Evil 3 Remake a final score of a middling 6 out of 10. If you feel like you can welcome in the new action direction, it's mixed with the old Metroidvania direction, and the predictable story, then Resident Evil 3 is a game you'll enjoy. It's a good single-player experience that has its share of mess sprinkled throughout it. That concludes my review of the Resident Evil 3 Remake. If you like my reviews, you can like, comment, or subscribe. I also have social media links down in the description below, as well as a link to my online portfolio where you can see video game design works that I have done. I also have a link to my Backloggd profile where you can see my ratings. And with that out of the way, please make sure to have a nice day.